The period we're approaching is being compared to the first industrial revolution in terms of its disruptive ability. Do you think that's a fair depiction?
Sure. That's maybe even in some cases more so. I mean, the first industrial revolution was about steam power, and it was about machines that essentially displaced muscles, that took over manual labor. Now we're having what you might call a kind of cognitive computing revolution, where machines are taking on brain power. They're taking on that cognitive capability. And, you can ask the question, well, we've had these revolutions in the past. Why does everyone still have a job? Why don't we have unemployment already? And the reason is that people have this unique skill to think, to solve problems, and to learn. And that's what's allowed people to stay ahead of that march of technology. You can compare it to horses, for example. Horses got displaced, right? I mean, horses have kind of lost their economic role in the economy. And the reason is that horses could not adapt in the way that people do. But now technology is finally beginning to move into that final frontier as well. So you've now got these thinking, learning computers that are going to begin to compete with people in that primary capability that so far has allowed us to stay ahead of all of this. And so that's why I think, and I think a lot of other people think, although there's not general agreement on it, I think that this could be the biggest disruption we've seen yet in terms of, what it all means for jobs and the economy and society.
So humans could go the way of the horse. That's a sobering thought.
Yeah, that's, I think, a possibility. And the reason is that the machines are coming after that thing that makes us so very different from horses, right? I mean, the difference between people and horses is that we can learn to do new things, we can adapt, but machines are going to be able to learn and adapt as well in the future.
Now, no one doubts that artificial intelligence, along with advanced robotics, 3D printing, and the Internet of Things, will disrupt the labor market. It's just a question of how much. One influential study coming out of Oxford University estimated that 47% of jobs in the US could be eliminated using existing technologies. Everything from fast food and retail jobs to legal and medical jobs are in the crosshairs. Where there is disagreement is whether new jobs will come along to replace the old ones. In the past, they have, and they eventually led to higher standards of living. But some people think that this time it's different. Nick Cernick is a lecturer at King's College London and co-author of Inventing the Future.
I think this argument that history shows we always create new jobs, it's a really common argument. And I think they're right that, history does show that. But I think there's a number of important caveats to that. The first one is when we look at sort of the initial wave of automation in the late 1800s or so, we do see jobs come about eventually to replace the lost jobs in agriculture, but they take about 40 years to arrive. So we have a period of about 40 years where there's mass poverty, there's a huge amount of slums within places like London. It's just not very good for workers. So in the medium term, I would expect maybe some jobs to arise, but this still doesn't sort of get to the heart of the matter with, short term. What should we expect over the next decade or two? The other aspect is these historical sort of precedents, they also had a different social context. And I think that's really important to note as well. So when we look at, say, the early 1900s, we have machines taking jobs, but we also have a workers' movement which is aiming to reduce the working week. So this effectively means that, yes, there's less work to be done, but everybody is sort of equally doing less work. So we've got a move from a 60-hour work week down to about a 40-hour work week in most places. And this effectively means that the impacts of automation aren't felt because we are reducing the working week. Now, when we look at post-World War II era, again, we see automation taking jobs, but we also see high levels of employment, good wage growth, good productivity growth. But what's also happening there is that we have a unique situation in the history of capitalism where we've got governments which are committed to a full employment policies. So they're doing all sorts of efforts to make sure that there are sufficient jobs for people. We've also got half of the population, women, now working in the home rather than in the workplace. So this is, half the population isn't looking for a job. The other aspect is that those periods of high economic growth were unique. We haven't seen them since, and I highly doubt that we're going to see them again. So when we look today, we're missing a movement for a shorter working week. We're missing a period of high growth. Instead, we've got secular stagnation. And we're also missing governments being committed to full employment policies. Instead, most governments today are committed to austerity and cutting down government debt rather than trying to get more and more jobs for people. So I think the sort of looking at history is good, but I think we also need to take into account the fact that a lot of the things which enabled that no longer exist.
Well, yes, I do think it'll be different.
Robert McChesney is a professor of communications at the University of Illinois and co-author of People Get Ready, The Fight Against a Jobless Economy and a Citizenless Democracy.
Most economists I've talked to, not all by any means, and I quote in People Get Ready several who are really concerned, but most economists hold the position that, well, eventually new technologies always come along. It's built right into capitalism, and they disrupt old industries, but they create new ones and create new jobs, and eventually all is better. I mean, 100 years ago, 90% of people were working in agriculture, 150 years ago, and then they shifted to better jobs in manufacturing, and then they left manufacturing and go to service. And when service jobs get replaced, they'll move on to something that will come along to replace it. The market will always replace jobs that are lost. That's what history shows. And I think this time, though, the reliance on the market magically producing good jobs or decent jobs, the evidence is really thin there. And this wouldn't necessarily be a problem for society if we had an economy that could adjust. And so the benefits of this technology were shared across the board and everyone took advantage of it. But in the United States and in Canada and most capitalist economies, they're not really structured for this sort of revolution to be shared equitably. And, that's not just morally and ethically a problem and politically a problem for democracy. The great irony here, and this is why the problem will come to a head, is it's also a tremendous problem for capitalism, because capitalism needs people to buy its products in order to have incentive to produce them. And that was what happened in the Great Depression. People couldn't buy the products, so people stopped producing them. We had massive unemployment. Well, we're looking at a situation coming up where our economy could return to that situation, where we're going to have not enough money to want to buy stuff that firms are going to produce it. And so instead of having this technological revolution lead to a bounty shared by all and making life vastly superior to what it had been across the board, instead it could lead to a world in which we'd wish the computer had never been invented.